I'm Jacob Lewis, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. This week, Lee Seecamp swaps chairs. He is our guest with theologian Russell Moore as host. They dig into Lee's most recent book, Scandalous Witness. This conversation reimagines the ways that Christianity might truly serve the common good in a divided America, especially in an era of rising Christian nationalism.
Hello friends, Lee Seecamp here. There is, as you may have noticed, no shortage of content in the world. Opinions endless, outrage plentiful. Deep wisdom and thoughtful perspective slightly harder to come by. That's part of why we created the NSC Notebook. It's our weekly email from the world of No Small Endeavor with reflections on a good life, behind-the-scenes insight into our interviews, and quotes that stuck with me long after those conversations ended. You'll also get a curated list of what I'm reading, watching, and listening to, books, movies, music, and other things I think are actually worth your time. It comes to your inbox every Tuesday, completely free. So if you'd like one less thing to doom scroll and one more thing to actually enjoy, sign up for the NSC Notebook at nosmallendeavor.com. When Laura and I had 3 young boys running around, we cared a lot about what our kids were eating. But like every parent, we learned pretty quickly that good intentions have to fit into real life. You want your kids getting the nutrients they need, but you also want to avoid all the extra sugar, artificial ingredients, and things you can't even pronounce. That's one reason I like Hiya. Unlike a lot of kids' vitamins that are basically candy in disguise, Hiya's chewable multivitamin is made with 0 sugar, 0 gummy additives, and no artificial junk. It includes a blend of organic fruits and vegetables plus essential vitamins and minerals like vitamin D, C, zinc, folate, and B12. And what's fun is you get a reusable bottle with stickers in your first order, and then they send refills every month. And Hiya just launched another exciting initiative, Kids Daily Growth Plus Protein. It's a clean protein powder with added minerals and healthy fats designed specifically for growing kids. Just mix it into water, milk, or a smoothie to help support muscle development, cognition, and all the energy kids need for their busy days. We've worked out a special deal with Hiya. Receive 50% off your first order on any of their products. To claim this deal, you must go to hiyahealth.com/NSC. This deal is not available on their regular website. Go to hiyahealth.com/NSC and get your kids the full body support they deserve.
Hello, this is Russell Moore sitting in for Lee Camp with Lee Camp this week. This is an unusual thing for you to be on that side of the table. But I wanted to talk today with you about your new book. It's not new, but it's new coming out in paperback, Scandalous Witness, a Little Political Manifesto for Christians. And I just have to say, Lee, when people are splitting up their families, they don't want to get together for 4th of July weekend because they're afraid of how these political divisions are going to come up. Why a book on politics at a time when people want to forget there's any such thing?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that has driven me so much in the agenda, or I've wanted to drive the agenda of that book, is that we've tended to narrow politics to a very specific, particular form of what we seem to mean by the word, namely American partisan political engagement. Mm-hmm. And obviously that's very hostile and increasingly belligerent today. And yet in the kind of ancient, older classical traditions, politics goes back, the root of the word polis, which is just the word for city in Greek. The art and science of politics is simply asking the question, how should we arrange the affairs of our community? And those are questions that we can never escape and that we're always navigating and that we're always working with. And I'm trying to suggest that there are theological traditions in the Christian tradition, which seem to have been obscured because of the partisan political stuff, that can actually help us in the midst of our hostilities and help us in the midst of our belligerence, and say there are different possibilities for the way that we're going about these kinds of questions.
I can imagine somebody who is saying, look, the political part, fine, can deal with that. It's the for Christians part.
Yeah.
Because when you say there are resources that can help, I think there are a lot of people who will say, well, haven't Christians helped enough? And you even acknowledge in the book that Christianity in America has become a bad public joke.
Yeah.
Yes. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you raise that question because in some ways when some people ask me about doing No Small Endeavor, I will often acknowledge pretty quickly that regular listeners to our show know that I'm a theologian, Christian theologian, and yet they allow me to do that in public and allow me to do that in public media. And one of my overriding concerns is that I do think that the Christian church in America has so often been such a bad neighbor that I want to try to find out how can I, in the public space that we've been allowed to have a voice in, show up in a way that actually shows up as a good neighbor. And I think that that's possible by, and I don't necessarily go into these things in the book, but at least some of the things that are driving our work with No Small Endeavor is there are certain common questions that we all care about human flourishing, about what does it mean to pursue a common good that we can all celebrate even in the midst of our differences and find ways to practice some sort of engagement with one another as good neighbors. So far as the explicitly Christian piece of that, which I do talk about more in the book, is that, I think a lot of times we forget that Christians especially have forgotten in this current moment that the riches of a commitment to social goods, and those can be social goods like practices of forgiveness and reconciliation, practices of nonviolence, practices of love of your neighbor in spite of difference, seeking to facilitate institutions that serve our neighbors and that serve our communities. All of those have been very vibrant parts of the Christian tradition, and that I think if we would spend a lot more time focusing upon those things rather than partisan politics, we would be a lot better neighbor in the American context.
Do you think it's possible in America right now for people to agree on the common good? To even agree on what the good life is? I mean, this podcast, this show is about a pursuit of the good life.
Right.
Do we even know what that is?
Well, I think that that's a really good question, and it's one that I argue with about myself a lot, and seldom do we surface it. We kind of operate based upon a sort of presumed common good, and so I think I would say that the answer for me would be yes and no. I mean, there's always going to be difference about any and every potential issue. And yet I do think that there are certain commitments that I suspect that you can at least find a lot of agreement on, not, obviously not unanimity. But I think that we could find a way in which we want to say we want to treat every human being as an equally honorable human being. But for the Christian tradition, the Jews and Christians, because of the image of God in that person. And of course, that's one of those traditions that has informed Western political liberal traditions is in the rise of the human rights tradition, right? And so obviously, troublingly so, we find certain people that seem to be arguing against such a thing that I find deeply troubling. And I would want to make the case, no, this is part of what the Christian tradition has given to the Western world that is truly good, and I want to keep arguing is part of the common good. And so I guess I would just say that, yeah, I think that there are obviously always going to be differences, and there are real live political debates about these things. But I also think that there are a lot of things in common that Jews, Christian, Muslims, and atheists also can find agreement upon a number of the facets of what the common good might entail.
Are we in a place where Jews, Muslims, Christians, and atheists are even together enough to have those conversations with the kind of sorting that's been done in American life?
Well, I would only say that I occasionally get to be in contexts where I experience that, And I'm really grateful for those occasions where I get to. I mean, you and I both live in the Bible Belt, and so we probably don't have as diverse experiences as you might in New York City, say, or Washington, D.C. But I do get to have some of those kinds of instances of being together, and I often find them refreshing. I mean, I think one of the things that I've liked about even teaching in undergraduate context for years is that even when I was teaching Christian theology, I oftentimes found my atheist students more interesting as students than some of my Christian students because they had so grappled with the questions that were worth grappling with and would raise them in class so that all of a sudden we all get to confront these very live questions and say, okay, well, what do we do with that, right? And so I think that there are contexts where that kind of stuff can happen and does happen often in very fruitful ways.
We're at a time where, as many people have pointed out, politics has become a religion and religion has become politics in many sectors of American life. And that's what most people, when they even think about that intersection of politics and religion, there's a kind of just leave it alone.
Yeah.
Let's keep those things apart. But you argue in this book that Christianity is not a religion at all, that it actually is a politic.
Yeah.
But I think you mean something really different than Jerry Falwell Sr. or Jr. meant by that kind of an analysis.
Yes, I very much mean something quite different than what the Falwells meant by such language. Yeah, so by saying, somewhere early in the book, I say that, I've often told my students that I think you'll do much better to understand Christianity if you think of it as an interpretation of history as opposed to being a religion. And what I mean by that is that let me first kind of define the way I'm throwing the word religion around, which, as you and I both know, that there's all sorts of academic work done, the whole cottage industry on arguing about the word religion and what religion means and entails. And I'm not really interested in that debate, but I'm using it in one kind of specific way in the book, namely this sort of idea that religion is about the afterlife and it's about your personal relationship with the divine. And what I'm wanting to suggest is that's not what Christianity is, as I understand it. It does entail a question about your personal relationship with God and your personal conception of the meaning of life vis-a-vis your understanding of the divine. And in Orthodox Christianity, it does entail claims about resurrection. No question about that in my mind. But to reduce religion to primarily about those questions, I think is an insufficient accounting of what Christianity is. And so that's why I push into this word of saying it's a politic. And this goes back to the definition I gave a moment ago, right? When people say Christianity is not political, I tend to think, well, you've never read Jesus, right? You've never read the New Testament if you think it's not political, because if politics is asking the question, how do we arrange the affairs of our community in the classical sense, right? We ask, okay, what do we do with money? What do we do with enemies? What do we do with offenses? What do we do with caring for the least of these? What do we do with caring for immigrants? And it's like, well, who talked about that? Well, Jesus talked about that stuff all the time, right? And so there is this sort of inherent political shape to Christianity that we miss if we have this sort of presumption that Christianity is not political. It's like, no, it's not just, it doesn't merely have political implications. It is at its heart a politic. And one of the ways in which that then rubs up against so much of American and indeed all contemporary nation state politics is that there's this sort of, in my understanding, a sort of deep commitment to not seeking to have power over, but instead to embrace the power that is in service to. And then that shapes the way all of those political commitments that I was talking about a moment ago, they can't become something that we shove on other people, I think, but instead invite people to. And so those are just very different ways to think about practicing what we might call politics.
I can't help but think about an atheist friend of mine who I wish he were here with me right now, because I know what he would say.
Yeah.
Which is to say, yeah, but you all do keep pushing that on other people. And there's this kind of cynicism that comes with the power that comes with saying, if you disagree with me, we're not just opponents. If you disagree with me, you're disagreeing with God.
Right.
And that just seems to be a perpetual trap.
Yeah. I mean, I think I would agree with your atheist friend. And I think that a lot of, both in this book and other things I've written, I don't know how anybody takes Christians seriously if we don't do a lot of time saying, but we've really screwed this up, and saying it over and over and over and over again, right? And there are, and we screwed it up long before the United States of America, right? You can look back at the Christian tradition in the Western world with all sorts of horrific instances, right? You have, and these are even among, some of the people that are seen as some of the greats. You think about somebody like Charlemagne in the Middle Ages, and Charlemagne is, seen as one of the great Christian rulers in Europe. And yet he has this so-called baptismal policy when he goes in one of his campaigns to conquer, in Western Europe, and he sets forward this baptismal policy where he says you can either come accept baptism or you can die. And that's a very effective evangelical strategy, I suppose, on the one hand, to get people baptized, but you've completely subverted what I understand Christianity to be. Namely, an invitation to this beautiful, winsome way of life that actually rejects that kind of power over. And yet, because you've reduced it to a religion, some sort of talisman, and reduced to this baptismal rite or whatever sacramental rite you might want to be imposing on people, you've gutted Christianity, it seems to me, of what Christianity can be for the good of our world by that kind of power. So yeah, I would agree with your atheist friend.
Would you agree that we're at a time right now where I have a rabbi friend who describes the exact same scenario that I have seen happening, not just in church after church after church, but organization after organization, where he says, look, my congregation is really divided over Israel-Gaza in that case. And we're trying not to set off a tinderbox, trying to keep everybody together by kind of long-term shaping and forming people together, but not going directly at that issue for fear that it will just ignite controversy. How would your way of seeing this in this book address that? That's it, because it seems to me that could go either direction. You could use that as simply cowardice. There's something on the table we don't want to talk about, so we'll wait until there's time. That's, of course, what Martin Luther King talked about in Letter from Birmingham Jail. But there also was a sense of, well, we are at a kind of unique time where I don't think there were that many churches divided over Eisenhower versus Stevenson, in the 50s, the way that we are now about almost every subject. I mean, any cultural topic can be that way. How do you know if you're avoiding something to which you ought to bear witness, or if you're just being prudent and not inflaming?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you raised the word prudent, right? Because the virtue of prudence is multifaceted and complex, and is perhaps one of the most complicated of the virtues. I think what Aquinas had something like even 8 different facets of prudence that you need to master if you're going to be good at prudence. And so it's very complicated, right? Yeah. And I don't think I say that it's complicated in service to cowardice, but I say, but prudence asks the question, what's the best way to do what's good? What's the best way to do what's right? And that's not always there's always not an easy answer to that question. And so I think that I have been in contexts where I have felt like there's cowardice, and that prudence gets used as a cover for cowardice. And then I've been in another contexts where I've seen a lot of wisdom where a pastor or a local church congregation find some sort of way, sometimes slowly, but they find a way to communally address pressing social, political issues that stand in front of us. And I guess because I've seen it happen in a way that I think is true and courageous, I don't feel despair about the fact that it can happen. And again, I think that it requires a lot of care and a lot of humility, and sometimes what might to sometimes feel like a too slow of a pace. But it can be done, I think. And I think that it must be done. I mean, I think that if we use so-called prudence to cover over or just prop up what we call unity, then it can't really be prudence, because prudence always seeks the good. And similarly with courage, all the virtues, if they're not done, the Catholic philosopher Joseph Pieper talks about how any virtue not done with prudence is not virtuous, right? And the same way with all the virtues, if they're not done towards the end of a true good of the community and the people involved, then it's not a true virtue. And so I think that it requires a lot of discernment, but I think that it can happen.
The paperback edition of this book is coming out at a time in which the United States of America celebrating 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, 4th of July. There's a lot of events going on around it. And you say in this book that American hope is a bastard, which is the first time I've ever said that on the air. First time the word's ever said on the air. So it seems to be that right now you kind of have an argument going on between people who would say we had a golden age in the United States. We need to get back to that. Make America great again. And you have people who would say 1619 Project. Now, the entire thing was flawed from the beginning. It really was just about power over other people, including human slavery. It seems to me you're saying something different than either of those. Am I right?
Yes, and I appreciate you saying that. Yeah. How
so? If the United States is not the hope of the world.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think most people, if they really thought about it, would say that's true ultimately. But it certainly seems, at least in the last 100 years, the United States has kind of held the world together, both in terms of example and in terms of direct action. So what do you mean by hope of the world, that we should toss that aside?
Well, this is crucial, I think, to thinking about what one means by Christian nationalism. And, I hear sometimes people throw around the term Christian nationalism if they see, for example, some Christian who is seeking to bring some Christian conviction to bear upon a conversation in the public square. Mm-hmm. And they'll say, oh, wait, don't bring your Christian nationalism in here. And I'm like, that's not Christian nationalism. That's what we all do, right? Mm-hmm. We all have certain convictions that we believe to be true. And generally speaking, I think philosophically, right, if you believe something to be true, you believe it to be good and you want it to be shared. And so we all have some sort of sensibility that we would want our neighbors to honor the things that we think to be true and good and beautiful. And I don't think of that as nationalism. I think of nationalism as a sort of commitment to a given nation state having some sort of messianic role in human history. And that there is a sort of salvific purpose that God supposedly has ordained some given nation in the unfolding of the salvation of human history. And so in my mind, that's a very different thing, and we should be very careful and pay a lot of attention to that kind of approach. And so you think, for example, about how, I quote Jefferson, that America is the great hope of the world, or Lincoln, who says America is the last great hope of the earth. or Woodrow Wilson, early part of the 20th century. It's a very interesting case, right? Because he is a very devout Christian, apparently, and he pushes the U.S., as I remember the history, into World War I, and does so with the justification that this will be the war to end all wars, which is fascinating language, right? Because that's what Christian theology would call eschatological claims, right? Mm-hmm. Because you're saying you're going to end war, which is seen in the prophets and in the Hebrew prophets as this is what happens when the final triumph of God comes into the world, as we finally end war. And Wilson says we're going to end war. We're going to bring about the eschatological purposes, and we're going to do it through war, through the United States, practicing war. And that kind of blows my mind, because, and then after the war, and he's going off on this lecture circuit, and there's some remarkable speeches that he does where he has one where he has this very provocative line where he says, "At last, everyone will see that America is the savior of the world." And so I look at that as highly askance, because I have a great deal of doubt that, one, that the claim is true, and two, that it's helpful. And I think that it's likely very, very damaging, because that sort of commitment contributes to an American exceptionalism that very quickly becomes justification and rationale for America getting away with all sorts of things. And so I liked what you said at the beginning about I'm not trying to do either one of those extremes. And what I want to keep insisting is that there are clearly some very beautiful things about the American experiment that are fundamentally a gift to human history. I have no question or qualms about holding on to that. And at the same time, there are some very dark realities about the American experiment that ought never be celebrated. And so I think that, either one of those extremes are not sufficiently truthful in my mind. And what we want to, in my mind, I care about what's true. And I want to keep saying, no, both of these things are true. And if either one tries to squelch the other, then I don't think we're helping us move forward in the most constructive way possible, right? So for example, right now, you've got on the stereotypical right, any kind of a desire to squelch any kind of critique of America and squelch the racist histories and so forth. And, I think it's quite clear that when you repress storytelling about one's failures, all you're doing is you're just postponing for that stuff to blow up in your face all the more down the road, right? And on the other hand, if you can't see any sort of goods, any sort of steps forward that have been made, then I think you're just contributing to a sort of social despair that doesn't leave us with any new creative, beautiful possibilities either. And so I think it's trying to find both of those, the goods of both of those that are going to be crucial in a moment like this.
You talked about World War I, and of course, after the war to end all wars, we had this time of exuberance. Great Gatsby comes out of that time, so forth. We also ultimately, it leads to Hitler and to some really dark things because there was this disappointment that came with that sense of utopian possibility. It would seem that we're not in a utopian time. If you look at public opinion polling, people seem to have almost despair when it comes to their own futures economically and in other ways. Do you see places where we have, though, our expectations too high in a way that's going to ultimately disappoint us?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know that I'm equipped to answer that question. I don't know that. I know certainly looking at college students, there seems to be much less hopefulness about the current moment, when you're coming out of college than there would have been 10, 15, 20 years ago. But I don't know how to measure that, and I don't know necessarily how to speak to any sort of given expectations. But I don't know, do you have any more specific way into that question that top of mind?
Well, it seems to me that right now you almost have at the very top some utopianism or extreme dystopianism. The idea from, say, the tech sector. We're just on the verge of, in the way some people put it, it's almost like what Karl Marx envisioned ultimately, with nobody has to work. There's abundance for everybody there. And then on the other hand, people building bunkers. And so I'm wondering if there's any place where we kind of have blinders on, and if we look back, we're going to say, you know what, we weren't bearing a scandalous witness at all to this area of life because we just didn't see it happening.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess the way I tend to think about that, or what I want to keep holding on to for myself, is we both know Miroslav Volf, and he was telling me years ago about Alexander Schmemann and how he insists that we've got to hold together simultaneously at all times both grief and joy, both delight and sorrow at the brokenness of the world. And I think my own lived human experience is that that's fundamentally true, I think, for all of us, right? Is that from a Christian theological perspective, it's the claim that we live in a world that's broken, while at the same time believing that life and the triumph of love over hatred and hostility has broken into the creation, and we await the consummation of that. And so there's always these dual realities that are in tension with one another, but we're invited to, or called into, required to live into this space of where we're always holding on to both of those. And if we don't hold both of those, then I think that there's we're probably falling under some sort of deception. And that truthfulness about lived experience is going to say, yep, there's joy, and yep, there's grief, and we've got it every day, all the time. And to ever expect a sort of ease in which there's never any of that kind of pain or grief is simply unrealistic and not true. And at the same time, some of the people that I find most compelling as friends or individuals that I know of, right, are people who have gone through great grief and still may have the long tail of that grief in their lives, and yet they have found a way to live with joy and to live in a way that they're paying attention to the delights of the world. And so I think that that sort of stance, the more we can cultivate that socially and at large, that's a form of truth and truthfulness, I think, that would serve us well.
When we were talking a few minutes ago about, is there a place where people actually can agree on common good? One of the words that a lot of people would use for that is values. I value this for my community, you value this, and we have some overlap here. But you say in the book that values can actually corrupt.
Yeah.
Not just our ideals, but specifically in talking about religion, can corrupt Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, in a lot of this stuff in the book, I'm trying to be a bit provocative, but I think that that's true. And the way I try to illustrate that is that in the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., there's an exhibition on the slave Bible. Mm-hmm. And this was the Bible that one of the missionary societies wanted to get the Bible in the hands of slaves in the 1800s and the early 1800s. And the slave owners objected because they didn't want something that potentially unsettling to slaves in the hands of slaves. But then they said, however, we'll let you if you redacted it and you only put the parts in the Bible that we agree to. And I laugh.
No Exodus.
So I laugh only because of how horrific it is, right? And you know, you're exactly right. There's no Exodus story, right? Which is the paradigmatic story for Jews in the Hebrew Bible, right? It's the sort of story of who they are is the Exodus. But because it's an exodus from slavery, it's not going to be in the slave Bible. Now you have the stuff that paints Potiphar, as acceptable and passages about submitting to the slave owner, that's acceptable, that's included. Similar kind of stuff in the New Testament, passages that say, well, let the slave, submit to the slave master, that stays in. But the stuff that's going to point to the alternative is excluded. And so I think that sort of lived artifact, I think, runs parallel to the way a lot of our language about Christian values seems to be functioning in American culture in the last, say, 40 years. And that is that we pull out some element of the narrative, and then by hook or by crook, as your atheist friend was saying, push that on everybody else while ignoring the rest of the narrative. And those things oftentimes are going to make a whole lot more sense when they're kept in the narrative of a God who comes among us as one enfleshed, who is vulnerable, who sets aside the ways of power and sets aside the ways of making others submit to him, and takes on the form of a servant and seeks the good of his neighbors, and calls us to love of God and love of neighbor, calls us to forgiveness, calls us to reconciliation, calls us to love our enemies, calls us to pray for those who despitefully use us. Right? When all of those values, so-called, are placed in that narrative, all of a sudden the shape of what those narratives might mean lived out in our midst is a very different thing than just extracting them from the story and plopping them down, just like the slave Bible did.
I was just looking at a quote from Kurt Vonnegut saying, you have people wanting to put up the 10 Commandments in classrooms all the time, but I've never heard of anyone asking to put up the Beatitudes. And
I'm so glad to hear that Kurt Vonnegut said that. I've said something like that for years. So,
well, it seems to me that if you think about maybe why that is, John Guerra has the song "American Gospel," where he talks about "Blessed are the ruthless,
right.
the
It's
achievers,
a great song.
the one." Yes.
Yep.
Might it be that somebody would say that's because if you're saying things like "Blessed are the poor in spirit," love your enemies, that this is kind of impossible. It sort of goes against human nature, and there's no way we can do it.
Yeah. Hey, friends, one of the things we've learned from listeners is that many of you don't want to just listen to these conversations. You'd like to go deeper than that. That's part of why we created NSC Plus, which is our subscriber community, where we share additional conversations, reflections, and bonus material connected to the themes of the show, especially looking for ways that this can relate to the practice of your own life. Recently, we started a new series called Reflections on a Good Life, in which I share brief reflections arising from some of our favorite NSC interviews. You might think of it as a weekly 7-minute episode in which I pull out some pearl of wisdom from an interview and suggest a question on which you might choose to meditate to further cultivate some goodness in your own life. We've also launched a new bonus series called Books You Should Know. In the first installment, I sat down with Dr. Lee Warren for a conversation that quickly became one of my favorite interviews I've done in quite a while. It's all waiting for you over at NSC Plus. And just as importantly, NSC Plus is what helps keep No Small Endeavor on the air and available for free to everyone. Subscriptions start at just $5 a month, and if these conversations have been meaningful to you, we would truly love to have you join us. You can learn more at nosmallendeavor.com or click the link in the show notes and join NSC Plus.
If we knew more about our sleep, what would we do differently? Would we go to bed at a consistent time or take steps to reduce interruptions to our sleep? With Sleep Score, Apple Watch measures your bedtime consistency, interruptions, and sleep duration. Then, every morning it combines these factors into an easy-to-understand score from 1 to 100. So you'll know how to take the quality of your sleep from okay to very high. Know your sleep score with Apple Watch. iPhone 11 or later required.
This is going to be an extremely busy month. I have to watch 104 soccer games, follow the pregame, the postgame, yell useless opinions at the TV. It's a lot. So I knew that when it comes to screening for colon cancer, the choice was clear. The Cologuard Plus test. It can be used at home and can only take 15 minutes, so I can do it during halftime and not miss any action. If you are 45 or older and at average risk, ask your healthcare provider about screening for colon cancer with the Cologuard test. You can also request a prescription at Cologuard.com.
Well, it's not impossible. It's hard, but it's not impossible. and we have examples of people who did it. Martin Luther King Jr. was riddled with character defects, but he found ways to do it. And even, 1 year prior to his being assassinated, I think maybe to the day or plus or minus 1 day, right? He did that famous speech in Riverside Church about the Vietnam War. And he said, if we can't repent of this, then this is going to undo us. And we must set aside our love of war making. And so, is he successful? Well, if by success we mean everybody says, oh, you're right, Dr. King, let's just quit and let's do what you say. Well, obviously he wasn't successful. But was he successful in terms of bearing witness in a way so that we see a new possibility for what's possible? I think he was very successful. And so you and I both would know, a lot about the work of Reinhold Niebuhr. And Niebuhr famously talked about things like love of enemies as the impossible possibility, right? And he insisted, no, you can't really expect us to do this stuff in human history because we're riddled with pride. And it seems to me that there's a difference between saying, are you ever going to be able, as Niebuhr thought the ethic of Christ called us to, really completely empty yourself of self-interest? Well, no, I doubt it. There might be a few, some of the saints through the Christian tradition that have done that, but most of us aren't going to be able to pull that off. Even through all the submission we might seek to do to the Holy Spirit, we're probably not going to be able to pull that off. But that's a different thing than saying, will you seek to kill your enemy, or will you somehow try to seek their good? Those are different things in my mind. And so I think that by that sort of move that Niebuhr made, he made Jesus irrelevant. And again, he's a Christian theologian, right? He's the Christian theologian making Jesus irrelevant in those ways. And I'll put in parentheses, I really respect a lot of what Niebuhr did, and he did a lot of fascinating stuff. And he, if you want good social critique, I don't know how you can find somebody doing much better than he does. But on this particular point, I find that really problematic. Similarly, Martin Luther, the famous Protestant reformer in the 16th century, he has this essay on the Sermon on the Mount. And he says that, in effect, he says, look, if you want to know what your job is as a lord or a judge, as a lord or a lady, prince, he in effect says, don't read the Sermon on the Mount, read the job manual, and it'll tell you what you should do. And the Sermon on the Mount is irrelevant for that. And I think that's cheating. I think that, that those sorts of ways of setting aside what seems to be central to the way of Christ ultimately subverts the gifts that Christianity could give to the world.
You talk a lot in the book about violence and a sort of response to violence. But what about somebody who would say, well, the things that we've been talking about today, take, for instance, the slave Bible.
Yeah.
We don't have the slave Bible because we have 13th and 14th Amendments, and we have 13th and 14th Amendments because we had a civil war and because the Union won. And you can look at other instances in history where it seems violence was necessary to produce justice. Where is that wrong, in your view?
Well, I think that a couple of things about that. One would be that in the biblical tradition, the various so-called principalities and powers get used in lots of ways in God's providence in the biblical storytelling for good and for the sake of justice. And some of these are rascals, right? The Babylonian emperors and Persian kings and so forth, and who are not lovely people. And the Bible, the biblical tradition claims that God was using even their violence for God's purposes. And so sometimes who knows, and I'm not the judge of providence. Second thing I'll say is that the mainstream position in the Christian tradition with regard to war and violence is obviously the just war tradition, which you know very well and know a lot about. And I find the just war tradition very respectable. And I think that it's a very rigorous moral system with regard to violence that has a lot of wisdom in it. And its commitment is to reduce death and destruction and to try to bring about peace, try to bring about some sort of just peace. And I think that those who have committed themselves to it, I would want them to take it all the more seriously rather than less so. And I think that what we see repeatedly in the unfolding of Christian history is how often the Christian community has said we believe in the so-called just war tradition, but we do nothing to form ourselves to let it have authority over the decisions that we make about war. And we're seeing a lot of this kind of stuff going on right now, even today, or even this week, in the last several months, where rhetoric and justifications are getting thrown about that are just fly in the face of the just war tradition. And so, again, I would say it's a respectable tradition. I understand it. It makes a lot of sense to me. And that's kind of what I wish I believed. I frankly wish I believed it. My life would be easier if I believed it. But then the third thing I'll say is that the most pointedly to your question is I think, as I understand the biblical witness, we're called to practice nonviolent love of enemies because it is the way in which God has sought to redeem the world in Christ, and Christ calls us into that. And I think that it's remarkable that for the first 3 centuries after the death of Christ, all extant writings that we have from the early church fathers and mothers, when they talk about violence or when they talk about war, as far as I know, they all say, this is not what we do because we follow Christ. And that obviously changes starting in the 4th century and so forth. And again, I respect that tradition. And I'll reiterate, those who say they believe it, go for it, because you actually could help us probably reduce a lot of the mindless violence that occurs in the world if you would help people take that tradition more seriously. But my understanding of the tradition is I think we're called to try to emulate the way of Christ in this regard.
Pope Leo came under a lot of controversy for saying recently, just war theory, even if you agree with just war theory, it's not possible in this kind of world. That we're at a time when just technologically there's the ability to do far more than was ever envisioned by just war theory. Is he right about that?
I just read last week Annie Jacobson's book, Nuclear War. Do you know about this book?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. My son put me on it. And it's mind-blowing that we are on this kind of razor's edge of potentially destroying 5 billion people by the end of the afternoon. And so I think that, there's obviously, since the rise of nuclear war, there's been a lot of so-called Catholic just war pacifists, right, who said, because we believe in the just war tradition, and now with the rise of modern warfare, these criteria can't possibly work in the modern world. And so maybe, who am I to correct the Pope? So he may or may not be right. I still would think that there would be certain scenarios in which you would have the two different sides maybe would have some sort of commitment, even if they don't know that they're committing themselves to a Christian tradition of the just war tradition, even ensconced in international law around war, right, are the sort of streams of the just war tradition that have informed international law and war. But surely in some cases that could still be possible. But certainly we have seen with certainly some of the language of our own president with regard to his demeaning, the end of the civilization tonight, zero understanding of what the just war tradition requires or entails.
When you think about this issue of witness, I'm imagining a couple people here. So we have Henry, who says, I really think that I ought to work with refugees and immigrants in my community. We have a refugee community coming in. I want to help them. I want to serve them. And I want to create the kind of neighborhood where they're not mistreated. And then you have Emma. And Emma says, I'm really concerned about what's happening to the psyches of especially young men being exposed to hardcore pornography at a very early age. I want to work with people of goodwill who might disagree on everything else to try to find ways to restrict access to that. So Henry and Emma both say this is the good that we want. How do we practically try to play that out in a way that bears the kind of witness you're talking about in this book?
I will readily admit that I have very little public policy experience, and so I'm reticent to come at an answer to that question from that angle, which a fully lived out experience is going to have to encounter that at some point, right? And so because I have zero experience in that regard, I don't want to try to answer that way. But I think one of the things that you point to there is that, like take the latter case of the young woman that's concerned about the debilitating impact of hardcore pornography on young men and the exposure to that. The remarkable thing about that is, you can find a lot of secular feminists who say you're absolutely right, and we need to do something about that, right? And so that's a kind of a classic case of where you really can find these sorts of coalitions of people from very different perspectives who can come together and say, we can measure the damage that this is doing to people. We have the studies and we can see the sort of debilitating impact this is having. So then let's come together and try to start working on that. And so in my mind, it's a sort of, you find the people that you can work with, and you begin to try to develop what's really at stake and try to get good at storytelling, and then start doing the kind of policy engagement. But and even still, I think, last week I was with a lot of people you and I both know in Washington with Comment Magazine, their festival. And one of the things that kept recurring in their storytelling with a lot of the public engagement, the public discourse, was upon the importance of, is the David Brooks language, culture prior to politics, right? And that rather than thinking that all the solutions are always going to be, first and foremost, I'll qualify the American political solutions. And his language was focus on local culture. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. Is like, how can we help try to find some solutions that don't presume the first thing we have to do is get legislation passed? And I don't know. And again, I'm not want to suggest that one should not try to pass legislation in certain scenarios. But maybe that's not the first stop. And maybe there's a lot of coalition building, local work that can be done that can have profound impact on our neighborhoods and on our communities.
Well, even it seems if you go backward to culture, I just heard this week about a Christian who said, our church has had a ministry to refugees. Nothing political, nothing in terms of policy. We just help them when they're in need. That's been cut out because the pastors said it's too controversial in our church. So if you have somebody who says, no, wait, we have some responsibilities to our neighbors, regardless of who they are. How do you start to communicate that to people and to try to move people along to see that common humanity in the least of these, without either just giving up or trying to impose your viewpoint on others?
I mean, I think in many ways it's what you and I both do, right? It's storytelling, conversation, writing, making arguments, publishing things that try to help people see things a different way, encouraging people to be courageous, those are cases where, when one seems to be in that scenario that you're describing, clearly caving to certain political pressures, that would be a place of where I would want to encourage people to, in that given church context, speak up, and keep talking about it and keep encouraging people to lean in towards these fundamentals of Christian faith.
how would somebody find in their own community the sort of kind of seed beds of witness that you're talking about here? There might be somebody who says, I really resonate with this, and that's what I want to do, whether from religious motivations or not religious motivations. But I don't know how to find where that's happening.
Yeah.
And I can't do it by myself.
Yeah. I would say just start looking and asking a lot of questions. And there are lots of places that these kinds of things happen, and there are a lot of remarkable spaces in which it happens. And with regard to the Christian tradition, I'm very grateful for my local church. Our local church is by no means perfect, and sometimes it drives me crazy. But this kind of stuff happens and bubbles up repeatedly in the history of our church, right? Care for street children in Kenya. We've gotten hundreds and hundreds of kids off the street in Kenya, or the wells that we've drilled around the world, millions of dollars worth of wells. Care for orphans and needs of children to be adopted in Tennessee. A nonprofit started maybe 70 years ago that I don't know how many kids have been adopted or taken into care through that ministry, just on and on and on. And so there are lots of places where such good work is happening. And I think that, try to find, I love the phrase, right? Find the people who has something that you want and start talking to them and start asking them questions. They're around. Sometimes they may be hard to find, but they are around. And I think that just, finding publications that seem to resonate with where you're coming from and trying to read and connect with people that write and people that communicate and so forth. But it does require some leaning into it because they are there.
One of the reasons I think that's hard to find is there's this tension. Because even with just the words here of Christian and witness,
right.
Witness is a public thing. You're giving. We need people to give examples of this can be done, and this is what this looks like. But there's also the sense of Jesus says, "Don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing, and don't trumpet what you're doing." So sometimes you have people who are saying, "I'm actually trying to work for the good of the polis around me, but." How much is self-promotion,
right? And
how much is hiding my light under a bushel, right. To use another Christian metaphor here? That can be a hard thing to decide. When
I was one of the most humbling moments in my early years, I was working with a church here in Nashville, and I was talking about some of these things in public context, and so teaching context, and was being rather judgmental. Of saying we need to be doing more of this kind of stuff. And finally, after I had been kind of railing like that for I don't know how long, this dear, sweet woman pulled me aside and very gently said, "Lee, you're so right." And then she started telling me about the people that she had brought in to live in her house. And it was just like, oh, Lee. And it was precisely because what you're talking about, right? Yeah. Is that, no, we don't go up bragging about these things. So that can be tricky. But I think that at the same time, people who are doing such good work and trying to cultivate these spaces of hope and possibility, you can be on the lookout for people that are looking for you. Mm-hmm. And know that there are people looking for you, and let that be part of your witness as well, just the hospitality to let people come in and participate with you. And the sort of vulnerability required to say, okay, yeah, come on in, let's see what we can learn together.
You talk about in the book that a lot of the kind of engagement that you're talking about has to be ad hoc.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah, that's my way of saying I don't want to reduce this sort of vision to a partisan stance. And, there are, this is a very superficial observation that I think still communicates something that's true, right? So if you take the sort of traditional perspective on, let's say, conservative, prior to the last 15 years. Conservatism typically wanted to say we should avoid big government and celebrate business. And then you've got stereotypical left that's going to say we need to be suspicious of business, but we're going to find a lot of goods in big government. Well, all of that just depends upon the issue, doesn't it? Right? And there are ways in which we're increasingly seeing if you're not suspicious about some things about big government, then boy, you have your head in the sand, right? Mm-hmm. If you're always insisting that it always has to be small government, then boy, there's clearly some things that we need some sort of overarching vision of what's going to happen in the larger context. And so I think it's looking for, rather than some sort of ideological commitment, is saying, let's take the issue that we have right before us, what we know about it, and rather than holding doggedly to whatever alliances we've supposedly have, to really say who has some good help with this, who has some good solutions with this, and try to do what can serve our neighbors.
How can we do that in a time of algorithms where we're being fed only the information that we want a little bit of it, we get more of it, and before we know it, we're in these sort of ecosystems that change even the way that we see what's happening. How do you find a way to kind of get out of that in order to engage ad hoc?
Right. That requires a lot, in my mind, a lot of commitment to insisting you're going to get a variety of inputs and a variety of relationships, and to read sources that you know are going to give you a different set of perspectives, to have conversations with people that they're not always going to agree with you or agree with each other, and let them push you and let them challenge you. And I think one of the things that years ago, I wrote a book looking at some of the different traditions in Christianity and Islam on war and peacemaking. And I got to spend a month in the Middle East, and I got to know one particular Muslim theologian that I'm still in communication with, and who I find very lovely human being. And one of the things I really learned out of that experiment in writing that particular book was that I thought that I felt like I understood myself better as a Christian because I had developed this friendship with this Muslim. Mm-hmm. And that neither one of us were trying to change who the other person was, but we both had honest conversation with each other about our traditions and how we saw the world and how we looked at things. And sometimes it was very challenging, right? But I came away from that just deeply grateful, because I thought, oh, he helps me understand better what I have said I believed for decades, right? Mm-hmm. And I want to believe that's true for him as well. And so it's in that giving and receiving of hospitality, not in spite of difference, but enriched by difference, that I think is crucial to being able to do what you're pointing us to there.
I wonder if your experience is like mine. I have a Muslim friend too, who very similar sort of dynamic. But what I found was it took a long time in our friendship to kind of let go of the sense of defensiveness, not about trying to beat the other person over the head, but just, I don't want to even acknowledge the bad aspects of my own tradition or any of my frustrations with them, for fear that that's going to that you're going to say, well, yeah, that's what Islam does, or yeah, that's what Christianity does. It really does take a while for people actually to get to know each other as human beings, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It does. I also think that can be expedited, though, by the more we can lean into vulnerability and just voice our own understandings of the failures of our own traditions before the other person feels like they even have to. Yeah. It will be more forthright and say, I know we really screwed up, and I know us and Charlemagne really screwed up, right? Or I know that we, in this particular case, one particular story, he was telling me, I won't repeat on the story because it's such a grotesque story about what some of the Christian crusaders did when they came in the first or second crusade. And he said, did you know that? And he told me the story. And I said, and I had never heard the story, except I just happened to have read the story the day before found this in a library in Bethlehem at the Tantor Study Institute on the hill above Bethlehem. And I just was very sad, said, I just learned that yesterday. And so I think the more we can just kind of lean into, yeah, we know we've messed up. We've all messed up. So let us just lean into it more quickly. And then all of a sudden, the discourse and possibilities of mutual edification, I think, open up much more quickly.
What's the role of art in this?
A great deal. I mean, in my mind, though I don't know that I use the word imagination much in this book, imagination is crucial to it all, right? Because it's all about imagining what can be. And whatever we imagine can be drives our sense of possibility and drives the sorts of things that we're willing to work for. And this, of course, is what art very often, not always, but very often art is just so good at. Our singers, songwriters, our painters, our movie makers, our storytellers. So often what they're doing at their best is that they are enlivening our sense of what is possible. And by doing that, they can give us immense gifts that we say, oh, maybe I can sow some seed in that regard. Maybe we as a community can sow some seed in that regard. I recently interviewed Allison Russell, as a beloved Grammy Award winner here in town. And one of the things that Allison kept saying in the interview with her was, this could be different. And I think she said that 2 or 3 times in the interview. He was talking about some troubling social situation. She said, this could be different. And I just found that so encouraging. And I thought maybe only artists are really good at being quite so hopeful and saying, this could be different. But we know it's true, right? You can look back at some of the things of, I recently spent a semester in Italy, and we would never dream of Florence going to war with Venice today. Mm-hmm. But that was not that long ago that, of course, they go to war with each other, right? There are all sorts of things today that we would just never dream that was going to happen, but they were realities not long ago. And so I think that it's important for us to be informed by history in such a way to imagine new possibilities, and that art so often allows us to have that new vision, that new imagination.
For over a decade now, I think, my wife and I have been going to No Small Endeavor, shows that you've done previously known as Token Show. And one of the things that I love about those shows, among many things, is the way that you're able to weave music into a spark of imagination and argument together in those shows. If you were to make a Spotify playlist for Scandalous Witness, what sorts of songs would be on it?
Well, there would certainly be some of the great American classical folk stuff, right? There'd be the Bob Dylans and the Woody Guthries, and more recently there would be John Guerra. And so that folk tradition would be crucial, I think. There would also be some kind of Bruce Springsteen, who cares about, at least in his music, seems to care a lot about the working man and the plight of working class America and the way in which the machine too often stomps on working class America. I think there would just be some good old rock and roll that celebrates life and love and fun and the beauty of it all. And there would be some hymns. I mean, I think that some of the old hymns that I grew up on that so poignantly draw us towards the possibility of a life of self-sacrificial love, that even though, I've been trying to practice this all my life and I'm still not very good at it. But the old hymns that draw us into self-sacrificial love, I think, would also have to be on the playlist.
Last question before I hand you back your own mic. What is the good life?
I love the question. And the best I've come up with in a context like this to answer that question is a line from Alistair McIntyre, the moral philosopher, who, I believe this comes from his book After Virtue, where he says, a good life is a life spent in seeking for the good life for humankind. And then he goes on to say, and commits itself to the cultivation of the virtues that are required in that pursuit. And obviously that leaves a lot to be answered and a lot of open questions, but I love that kind of answer that McIntyre gives us, because it's this call to say, we all have a sort of suspicion about what the good might entail, and to ask ourselves seriously the question about what does it mean to live a good life, and to take that question seriously invites us to say, okay, just take a step. Take a step, see what you learn, and then take the next step, and then take the next step. And then we learn as we go the sorts of habits and practices and dispositions and skills that we need to keep in that path. And then along the way, we'll probably say, if I'm going off this direction, at some point we'll probably say, well, there's things about that, and some things about that I still would hold to be true, and certain things about that I think I need to adjust, and I'm going to go over this way a bit. And so I love his sort of exploratory posture there of saying a good life's going to mean you first asking the question and then taking the step and seeing what you learn and keep taking the next step.
Lee Camp, the book is Scandalous Witness, a Little Political Manifesto for Christians, now out in paperback. Lee, thanks for letting me sit in for you.
Thanks, Russell. Great to have you.
Welcome to a new era of baseball's great spectacle, the T-Mobile Home Run Derby, live on Netflix. The biggest sluggers in baseball put their talents to the test on All-Star Weekend. Raw power meets star power. Big swagger meets bigger slams. And you don't swing to make contact. You swing to make history. Watch the T-Mobile Home Run Derby live on Netflix, Monday, July 13th at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific.
¿Qué hule? ¿Me extrañaron? Aquí tienen a Aurelio.
Esta es la saga más famosa de la televisión hispana.
Soy indestructible, imparable.
Y su banda sonora se escribe con balas.
Me gusta que te vean, que te aplaudan. Y eso está bien. Alguien tiene que ser el payaso. Pero cuando falles, que vas a fallar, no va a haber segunda vuelta.
Hoy vas a pagar con sangre.
El Señor de los Cielos, temporada final, martes 7 de julio a las 9:08 Centro por Telemundo y Peacock.
Thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carriot Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Our music director for the performance you're hearing now was Simon Martinson. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.
Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. Now, I was looking for fun ways to tell you that Mint's offer of unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month is back. So I thought it would be fun if we made $15 bills. But it turns out that's very illegal. So there goes my big idea for the commercial. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3 months, $90 for 6 months, or $180 for 12-month plan required. $15 per month equivalent. Taxes and fees extra. Initial plan term only. Greater than 50 gigabytes may slow when network is busy. See terms.
Finance lead just opened the credit card statement. A charge she can't trace. No receipt. That's how most business travel gets managed. Not with Engine. Engine makes it easy to control spend at the swipe. Get real-time visibility. Enforce spend policy before, not after. 30,000 businesses travel with Engine. You can too. Teams travel, spend, managed. All for free. Sign up at engine.com/control.